Afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces in the group. So I want to first recognize the other members of the Northern Forest Birds Network that I see in the audience. So a quick shout out to Alexis and Peg and Kayla and Michael for being here today. And when I am through with my prepared remarks, I would invite any of you to chime in with additional information that I may leave out. And really, this theme of helping birds in decline across the working forest landscape is really a two-parter. And I'm working on the first part and talking about the people and organizations and integrated approaches leading up to integrating the needs of birds into active forest management projects. And then Amanda's going to pick up and carry it further. So we've got a twofer set up here today. And here we go. Okay, so I first want to reference a groundbreaking study that was published in September of 2019. And we're affectionately referring to this as the 3 Billion Birds Initiative across the bird conservation community. And this study that was published in the journal Science revealed that since 1970, almost 3 billion birds, or 30% of the US North American bird population, has declined since 1970, signaling yet another widespread ecological crisis. And what this study revealed was tremendous losses across diverse groups of birds and habitats, from songbirds that people have known throughout their lifetime, such as meadowlarks, to long distance migrants, such as swallows, and backyard birds, including sparrows. So this is a wake-up call, right? That we've lost more than a quarter of our birds in the US and Canada. And 90% of these declines came from just 12 songbird families. And we know that these common widespread species play an influential role in our ecosystems. So if they're in trouble, then the wider web of life, including us, is in trouble. And so Amanda and I challenged ourselves to make our sessions somewhat interactive, and I'm going to be relying on Eli and Amanda to monitor the chat box. But does anyone have any guesses on what kind of losses we saw in terms of birds that breed in forests? Any ballpark estimates of the magnitude of loss in terms of numbers of species and populations? What's coming through?
And just to be clear, since I've been asking you to post to Slido, go ahead and post to the Zoom chat this time. So you can answer Katie's question just right in the Zoom chat.
Thanks, Eli. Do you have any guesses coming through? It's kind of a morbid game to play, but
nothing yet. So Katie, say the question again. It wasn't the number of birds. You've already said that. Was it the number of species?
So of the 3 billion birds,
Yep.
Any guesses about what percentage or how many of those come from birds that breed in northern forests or eastern forests?
I see. Okay, so we've got a guess of 60% from Cody, 30% from Caitlin, tanagers 50% decline. Oh boy, 2 billion. Most of them 40%. So kind of a range, most in the 40, 50, 60% range.
All right, well, I'm going to reveal the numbers and you can determine who gets the non-existent prize. But so forests alone, so if we think across all forests, that's 1 billion birds since 1970. So a third of those overall losses have occurred within forest habitats. So if we look at the boreal forest, and since we happen to be in that transition zone between boreal and hardwood forests here in northeast Minnesota, we've seen a decline of a 33% reduction of boreal forest breeding species. Or if we look at the iconic species of the evening grosbeak, we have 1 out of 10 evening grosbeaks remaining on the landscape that existed back in 1970. And if we also look at our eastern forest birds, this was the other major habitat group they looked at. If we look at wood thrush, which was another iconic species, 4 out of 10 wood thrushes remain on our eastern forest deciduous landscape. And we've seen overall a 17% reduction in populations of eastern forest breeding birds since 1970. Now, as an aside, this was another interesting component of the study. They were also able to analyze, and I should step back and say that that several independent data sources were analyzed to arrive at these findings, including 48 years of data from the North American Breeding Bird Survey, the Christmas bird count, and other data sets. And they also had the ability to analyze data from NextRad and migration monitoring. And in the last 10 years alone, they've seen a 14% reduction in the volume of spring migration. So even in the number of birds that are moving back and forth or moving in the springtime, a 10% reduction. Sorry, 14% reduction. So, okay, what's the solution to this? Well, we come back and revisit our strategic bird conservation model, right? And you've probably seen several iterations of this conceptual model, and Alexis just referred to it when she talked about adaptive management and monitoring within that context. And so this, I think, is a useful way to think about our individual roles with respect to bird conservation or bird-friendly forest management and how we connect to the other pieces within this adaptive management framework. And so a portion of this presentation is going to focus on the people and the communities around bird conservation and conservation of birds that breed in forests. And this graphic really steps us from the highest level, the continental level, and the organizations working at that sphere, down to the regional level, and then our sub-regional level here in the northern forests. And I'm going to step through each of these organizations and their roles and how their roles change as a lead up to then what we do with the information that they're giving us to respond to this bird decline crisis. So at the top of that graphic was the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, and they're really operating at the continental level. And this is a coalition of state and federal government agencies, private organizations, and bird initiatives in the United States that are working to ensure the long-term health of North Americans' native bird populations. And the real strength in NABC is the ability that it has to directly engage high-level conservation leaders to collaboratively develop and express a collective voice that promotes integrated all bird conservation. And you better believe that they're working on a collective approach to addressing this 3 billion bird decline that we've seen. And what's really interesting about NABC is they're integrating the 4 main taxa that we tend to organize ourselves under with respect to bird conservation. So they're engaging the land bird or songbird community, shorebirds, water birds, and of course, waterfowl. And one of NABC's earliest products since 1999 was the development of these bird conservation regions. And this is a map of all of the bird conservation regions across North America. And you'll see that I've highlighted Bird Conservation Region 12, which is the one that's of interest to us for this summit. And it's referred to as the Boreal Hardwood Transition Zone. So these bird conservation regions are ecologically distinct regions in North America that have similar bird communities, habitats, and resource management issues. And the primary purpose of these BCRs is to facilitate communication among the bird conservation initiatives at that more regional scale, to systematically and scientifically apportion the US into working conservation units, to facilitate more regional unified approaches to bird conservation, to promote new, expanded, or restructured partnerships around bird conservation needs, and to identify overlapping or conflicting conservation priorities. And it was envisioned that these BCRs would really function as the primary units for landscape conservation design and for which priority projects would emerge. And so if we step now from the continental level to the national level or to the land bird level, we get to this community called Partners in Flight. And Partners in Flight is engaged in all aspects of land bird conservation, from science and research and planning to policy development, land management, monitoring, education, and outreach. And their proactive mission is simple. It's keeping common birds common and helping species at risk through voluntary partnerships. And one of Partners in Flight's strengths is really in its science and the PIF databases. And there's 2 databases that I'm referring to here and that have been important for our work in the Northern Forest Birds Network. And one is a database that provides conservation assessment data and rankings for all North American birds at multiple geographic scales, kind of like a scorecard of which birds are in the most trouble, which birds are doing fairly well. The second database provides population estimates. So they have analyzed and worked with the different monitoring data sets and have produced estimates continentally and at the BCR, that bird conservation region scale, how many ovenbirds or black-throated green warblers or upland sandpipers that we have at these varying scales. So the science is really, really important in helping us to prioritize where we invest our resources to keep common birds common and help those species that are most in need. So in 2016, Partners in Flight released a revised land bird conservation plan for all of North America that really provided updates based on these new assessments and tools and specific recommendations, actions that we should be taking to address these continental threats and reduce long-term declines. And there was a whole section on bird-friendly or sustainable forest management in the Partners in Flight plan. But what was really neat about this latest plan is they organized and delivered the information by region and by bird conservation region. So they're really thinking again about that scale at which we can start to organize coalitions and put the recommendations into action on the ground. And I'll talk about those regional partnerships in a minute. But first, I want to just show the table that identifies the species that are most in need for our region. And this is where I'm going to make it interactive again, Eli. So the question that for you to respond to in the chat box is, which land bird or songbird species do you think rose to the top as priorities for us here in the boreal hardwood forests? I hear typing.
All right, we've got ovenbirds. That's our first guess. Spruce grouse, scarlet tanager, evening grosbeak, spruce grouse again, goshawk. The most common species, Peter says. Evening grosbeak again. Oh, geez. DEJU. You probably know what that is.
Dark-eyed junco. AOU codes are totally welcome.
Connecticut warbler. We got a bunch of guesses here. We're slowing down a little bit, Katie. Does anyone hit it on the nose?
Well, a few of them. So survey says, all right, so this is the table for the Upper Mississippi River Great Lakes joint venture, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I've circled in red the species for bird conservation region 12. So Kirtland's warbler, golden wing warbler, black-billed cuckoo, eastern whippoorwill, wood thrush, least flycatcher, or some of the species that came out for eastern forests. There's another forest category below, and I didn't have enough room on my screen, but these are some of the species that from those scientific assessments and databases and declines in populations. So there's what the trend in the species is, and then how important our geography is in terms of how much of the overall population or percent of the global population do we support here in our region. And it's through those two filters that a list like this is produced. All right, so now I'm going to move again. We've gone continental to national to regional. Now we're looking at a regional partnership, and that is a bird habitat joint venture. And for those of you that are new to joint ventures, I know Mark Nelson is here, and Mark is an active participant on the Joint Ventures Science Committee. And he may have spoken about that earlier. So joint ventures are self-directed partnerships of diverse organizations that work together to achieve agreed upon regional bird conservation goals that are directly linked or stepped down from these continental plans like the Partners in Flight plan. Now at over 240 million acres, the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture encompasses one of the largest and most diverse joint venture regions in the entire United States. And from this graphic, you can see that this Upper Miss Joint Venture, which I'll use for shorthand, covers all or portions of 10 states. Now, the mission of this joint venture is to deliver the full spectrum of bird conservation through regionally based, biologically driven, landscape-oriented partnerships. And so in the spirit of thinking about population objectives and stepping down these continental goals to meaningful actions we can take at a regional scale, I'm just going to touch upon a graphic that you probably already saw in Mark Nelson's talk earlier today. And these are the broad population objectives that the joint venture has set for its focal species. And you'll see a lot of overlap between the focal species that the joint venture has selected and those species that Partners in Flight recommended the joint venture pay attention to in their plan. It's a good thing that those line up. And so what's interesting about this 2020 joint venture land bird plan, and as you can tell, planning has been a big theme in the bird conservation world, is that instead of setting the goal as we want to have 100,000 Easter whippoorwills or 50,000 red-headed woodpeckers, the trends are expressed in terms of, or excuse me, the goals are expressed in terms of trends, right? So slowing the decline by 60% in 10 years, increasing the population by 5% in 50 years. And so these are, or 30 years rather, again, relying on these large-scale population monitoring programs to help us assess collectively, are we making progress towards or away from our goals for these species? And so, so I think it's just important to notice that we're moving from trying to achieve actual numbers to stemming tides or stemming declines, or if lucky, increasing populations. Now, the 2020 joint venture plan provides even more general guidance when it comes to conserving northern forest landscapes. And this excerpt that you see at the bottom of the screen is the language that you currently have, and that is to sustain viable populations of northern forest breeding species, we should focus on maintaining large, relatively unfragmented forest blocks greater than 10,000 hectares in size and with limited infrastructure development. Now, for some of the species that you saw on the previous slide, we have very specific conservation plans that delineate focal areas within which to target conservation and very specific stand level management guidelines for people to follow. And two examples are the golden wing warbler and the Kirtland's warbler. But for other species that lack dedicated initiatives, the joint venture plan is providing more, is recommending the following activities to alleviate threats to birds and forests. And two of the higher ranked threats were forest simplification and climate change. And so to really try to address those threats across a large landscape, they're recommending that people adopt sustainable forest management practices, for example, some of the principles in forest certification programs and the tenets of ecological forestry, that by adopting and integrating these bird-friendly enhancements where you can, it can help to mitigate and perhaps eventually reverse the effects of forest simplification and natural system modifications that have resulted from decades of management. And then to try to address the threat from climate change, there's a recommendation to really look to the climate adaptation resources and materials that are coming out of institutions such as the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Sciences, and to really integrate those into forest management to maintain healthy forests and bird habitats in an era of accelerated climate change. So again, very general guidance, intentionally so at this scale. And so now I'm going to introduce a newer element in the joint venture world, and that's this notion of a conservation delivery network. So stepping down from that 10-state area to a portion of a state or a portion of several states. And this is not a new concept. There are other bird habitat joint ventures around the country that have these targeted conservation delivery networks, but it's a new practice being employed within the Upper Miss joint venture. And I realize I'm running on my time a little, so I'm going to speed it up here. But basically, we're building out this new piece of the wheel to support ground up or grassroots efforts, and really shifting now from a focus of resources on conservation planning to how are we going to implement the recommendations from these plans. And so here's where I introduce the Northern Forest Birds Network. Here's our website. If you visit this website, there's a button that you can click on that would allow you to sign up for our regular newsletters and to become more involved and connected with the work of this network. And also on that page, we have a listing of our vision, goals, and products to date, which I'm not going to detail at this time. I'm going to focus on one of those. And so as we think about, I'm thinking about this like a relay race, right? And we're handing the baton from the people that are designing, what our landscapes need to look like and what our population trend goals are, to the people that are best positioned to make a difference on the ground. We need to translate these bird population goals into scalable actions in forest management that also meet landowner objectives. And to do this, and I'm going to credit Kayla with this language, we're shifting from a bird forward approach to a forest forward approach and thinking about how do we integrate birds into the working forest system. And to do that, we produced yet another list that really acts as a unifying list for all of Bird Conservation Region 12 to guide these activities. And so this is called the Priority Forest Birds Habitat Matrix. And you'll note in this matrix that we start by listing out species that are either high conservation concern, right, troubling trends, or species that we have stewardship responsibility for because we host 25% or more of the global breeding population in our landscape. And then what you can see is we've crosswalked these species. We show why they're on the list and also which state wildlife action plans list these as important. So we're kind of showing the relevance to each state. Then we've crosswalked them to different forest habitat types. And moving on, also different developmental stages following a disturbance event and other stand level or climate sensitivity considerations, right? And so again, these are the birds that we want people to keep in mind. And here's where they may intersect forest management planning is essentially what we're trying to, the dialogue we're trying to start by making this matrix available. We're then engaging with state level working groups, such as the Forestry for Birds Initiative in Michigan, to basically reach out to the forestry community and engage them in a dialogue and understanding how to translate these bird habitat needs into silvicultural prescriptions and to fit bird-friendly considerations into forest management planning. And very soon, Amanda Mahaffey is going to talk more about this whole exciting field of work that's making its way into our northern forest region. So again, we're trying to integrate the needs of birds into a working forest landscape. And what's so exciting about these projects is it's really bringing these disparate communities together. And we're really bringing the needs to the forestry community and are engaging them in designing and testing and implementing solutions that are practical and workable within their system. And so in closing, our Northern Forest Birds Network just met on Monday to have our work planning meeting for 2021. And I just wanted to showcase some of the other areas we're going to be focusing on in the year ahead. So publicizing and beginning to step down those broad goals in the joint venture plan into more specific guidance and recommendations for our bird conservation region. Reviewing and providing feedback into the climate adaptation workbook that's being developed through NIACS. And then of course, providing this role in really serving as a communication and coordination network. And these are some of the different mechanisms that we have in place to do that. So thank you for your time this morning or this afternoon, depending on if you're in the Eastern or Central time zone. And I'm happy to field any questions with the time remaining. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.